Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome back to Legislative Landmarks, the online series that explores the history of Connecticut through some of the most significant laws passed at the old State House, back when it was one of the two state capitals of Connecticut and the seat of the three branches of government. My name is Mariana Garcia. I'm a museum educator at Connecticut's Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House, and I'm delighted to be bringing you to the first of our programs for Black History Month, and the fourth entry of our Legislative Landmark series, Gradual Emancipation, Connecticut's Half-Step Towards Freedom. In 1784, the Connecticut General Assembly passed a law entitled An Act Concerning Indian, Mulatto, and Negro Servants and Slaves. This law, sometimes referred to as the Gradual Emancipation Act, stated that all children born to enslaved women after May 1, 1784, would be freed as soon as they turned 25 years old, thus slowly phasing out slavery out of existence in Connecticut. Or at least, that's how history tends to remember it. Gradual emancipation is considered by many to be the beginning of the end of slavery in Connecticut, cementing the idea of our state as part of the abolitionist North. But a deeper understanding of what the law really says and what it actually implies recontextualizes what it really accomplished and the intentions behind it. Here to talk to us about gradual emancipation in Connecticut is Professor Daniel J. Broyld. Dan is an associate professor of African American history and public history at Central Connecticut State University. He earned his PhD in 19th century United States and African diaspora history at Howard University. His work focuses on the American-Canadian borderlands and issues of Black identity, migration, and transnational relations, as well as oral history, material culture, and museum community interaction. Broyd's most recent article is titled The Underground Railroad as Afrofuturism, and he is currently finishing a book on American runaways to Canada before the Civil War. Thank you for being here with us today, Dan.
Cheers.
So we're going to start the program with a presentation from Dan. He's going to give us some historical context on gradual emancipation. After that, we're going to have a conversation with Dan with some questions that I prepared. And after that, finally, we'll have some times for questions from the audience. If you could, at the end of the program, please take a moment to fill out the survey at the end of the video description. And also, at any time, you can post your questions in the comment section, and we'll be sure to get to those at the end. So without further ado, Dan, take it away.
All right. Just going to share screen here. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Let me just put it up full here. So thank you for having me. I appreciate the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all on this program and doing this for the Old State House. And so the title of my brief talk will be A Long Process, Not an Event, Connecticut and Black Gradual Emancipation. So I wanted to start off with the Fugitive Song by Jesse Hutchinson Jr., because I feel like this is the perception of abolition in New England. So New England, thrice blessed and free, the poor hunted slave finds shelter in thee, where no bloodhounds ever dare to on his track. At the stern voice, New England, the monster falls back. Right. And this is the kind of perception you can see, how this song proceeds and how, New England abolition is kind of perceived throughout the region and also throughout the nation. We know that New England states started to end bondage right after the American Revolution. So you get New England states like Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut put into law gradual emancipation soon after the American Revolutionary War started. So the question becomes why did these New England states start to abolish slavery? I want to provide three reasons why I think that the New England states started to do this. Number one Slavery was not very lucrative in New England due to the cold climate and limited growing season. I think that this is important because, sometimes, New Englanders will act as if, that they had some kind of high moral, gumption, and that's why they started to abolish slavery. But I would submit to you that weather is a factor. Weather dictates what you can and cannot do. If New England had the weather of Georgia or the Carolinas, they probably would have had slavery a whole lot longer. Right. And so I want to present weather as a factor. I think we kind of understand weather in recent times here in Connecticut because of the snowfall that we just had. So weather dictates what you can and cannot do in certain circumstances. So as the weather got better in the United States, more the slave populations went up. And some would even argue that the intensity of slavery also went up as the weather got better. But I would submit to you, this is, one of the reasons why slavery was not as widespread in the New England states as it was in other locations. This is the one. Number two is the reason that a lot of people like to, aspire to, that, Connecticut got rid of slavery. It's kind of this moral reason why they understood that it was wrong and they got rid of it. It's the Enlightenment ideals, right, that they would get rid of slavery. So these states also attempted to morally confront the contradictions between holding Blacks in captivity and the American creed of freedom outlined in the Declaration of Independence. So they obviously knew it was a contradiction, right? In the American Revolution, it's kind of a line of demarcation where they could really see, the ills of their ways, right? The other thing that's really important last is, moreover, power holders and commoners wanted to protect the interests of white wage laborers from the competing free Black servitude, right? So white people understood that if Black people were working for free, they would eventually not be able to get jobs, right? And you see this like in the 1840s and 1850s when you get Irish and German immigrants starting to come to the United States of America. They didn't settle in like places like Georgia or the Carolinas or Mississippi. They settled in the American North and they settled in the American Midwest. That is because they understood if they went south, they wouldn't be able to get jobs because Black people are working for free. And essentially, there is no way for white wage laborers to kind of compete with free Black servitude because, people are doing it for free. So why would you want to hire a white wage laborer? And so these are some reasons why, New England starts to abolish slavery. You also have to ask the question, what was the point of using gradual emancipation laws in the American North to end slavery? And this had to do with the fact that you can't take property in the United States without paying for it. If you don't believe me, try it. Go out to a store and just begin to take property and not pay for it, right? And so this is, gradual emancipation is a way. You'll see how it's interacted where they'll, kind of set dates on how long you can own your enslaved property, right? And so this is a way for the states to kind of pay for the actual property. If not, the state of Connecticut would have to go like door to door and say, how many slaves do you have? What are they worth? Here's a check, right? Here's some money for those enslaved people, right? And so gradual emancipation allows them to kind of, move it out of the state gradually and also pay at the same time. This could be an expensive endeavor, right? To get rid of the people that are in bondage in your state, right? So between 1777 and 1804, you would see that northern states would begin to enact these gradual emancipation laws. It's very interesting. So, from Vermont to New York and New Jersey ending, you can see the New England states and when they would start to enact these gradual emancipation laws. But these gradual emancipation laws, it would take a long time for the states to really rid itself of actually enslaved people within the state. So these gradual emancipation laws are a start, right, to a process, right? So if we look at the Connecticut Gradual Emancipation Law, which we're here to talk about today in 1784, you will see how it reads. I just want to point out a couple of things to kind of deconstruct the act. So between 1702 and 1774, the Connecticut State Assembly passed a series of acts attempting to ensure that free Black people would not be a public liability. So you can see that before the Gradual Emancipation Act is put forth in 1784, there are issues with slaveholders, using up the kind of most productive years of their enslaved people until they got old or disabled, and then they would, kind of set them free, and they became a kind of public issue. The other thing is they enact the Non-Importation Act of 1774. So they were really concerned about people bringing enslaved people into Connecticut and disposing of them, right? Now, this legislation, however, gave a number of slaveholders kind of special permission to introduce new slaves. But you can see they were very concerned about who was coming into the state in terms of Black people and enslaved people, and they didn't want them to be disposed of within the colony and to become a liability on society. So the other thing that's important to know is that this act doesn't free anyone. Initially, right? It emancipates the future born children of those enslaved at the age of 25, right? And so if you're enslaved in Connecticut at this time in 1784 and this act comes through, this doesn't mean anything for you. It may mean something for your children, right? And so that's very interesting as well. Just want to show you a couple of things that comes after the act as well. In 1788, the Connecticut State Assembly took initial steps to curb the transportation of those in bondage from the state. So now they're worried about, people trying to, get Black people out of the state of Connecticut that they want to kind of make money off of or sell in other places. Also, they start a registration with the town clerk for the names and the ages and the sex of children born after March 1st, 1784, right? And so now they're kind of worried about people kind of sneaking people out of Connecticut. Also in 1797, you can see that they lower the age from 25 to 21, and I'm sure we'll talk about that throughout our conversation today. But also, you can see that the numbers, slowly start to matriculate down, right? And so you get to the point where in 1848, where there's just 6 slaves left in the state, and they would basically emancipate those people as well. But looking at Connecticut from the standpoint of before the Revolution and after the Revolution, you can see that of all of the New England states, that Connecticut has the most enslaved people, right? And also looking at the population of Connecticut years later in 1830, you can see that Connecticut still kind of sticks out in the region amongst the New England states. Also, when we talk about, okay, so you're emancipated, what does that mean to be emancipated? Do you have the right to vote? Well, in Connecticut, you don't. In 1830, also in 1860, just before the Civil War, you don't have the right to vote. You can see how that would manifest throughout the rest of New England. So when you ask the question of, how Connecticut is doing in terms of, enacting this gradual emancipation, it's slow. And also when you get free, you have no right to vote. But this is like really reminiscent of the problem with emancipation as a whole in the United States. You can see after the Civil War, when, during the Reconstruction years, you get the 13th Amendment that frees African Americans. You get the citizenship with the 14th Amendment, the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. But because of Black codes and Jim Crow laws, it would take until, the 1950s and 1960s really for this to really manifest itself for African Americans in the United States. So when you think about, emancipation in the United States, you have to look at these gradual emancipation laws, but also look at after the Civil War. I mean, Black men had the same rights, liberties, and immunities as whites by 1870, but it took until the 1960s for these things to manifest holistically for African Americans. So that makes me think about a poem by Langston Hughes called "A Dream Deferred," right? It takes a while for these things to really manifest for African Americans in the United States.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was really something special. Thanks for giving us a summary of the law and what it really implies. So, got a couple of questions for you now, if that's okay. So, first of all, slavery in the North is often overlooked by public history. The North is often seen like this bastion of abolition and emancipation where runaway slaves could come. But the truth is that it really was not. And there were still 10,000 enslaved people in New York by the end of the American Revolution. And in Connecticut, there were still over 1,000 enslaved people by 1800. So why does this happen? Why has history forgotten this reality?
Yeah, I think that that's a very good question. I don't think that all of the time that it's like forgotten. I think that it's like intentionally forgotten. And what I mean by that is, like, say, for example, I'm a very forgetful person and I forget stuff sometimes, right? But what happens if, like, say, for example, that, you had a book that I needed, right? And you just happened to leave it at home and you honestly forgot it. That's one thing, but it's another thing to say, like, you intentionally forgot it because you wanted to leave me out or you wanted to disadvantage me. And so I think that there is an intentional, trying to kind of paint the Northern region as, wanting abolition as an abolition kind of region and stuff like that. It makes us feel better. But that's not really how things manifested in the North. You have to understand that, the abolitionists made up less than 1% of the American North. And so that's really hard to kind of believe, because if you go to a library today, you can shoot a rock up and hit a book on an abolitionist. We tend to think that there's a lot of abolitionists, but it's actually a very small grouping of people. And if you look at it too, like, they all kind of run in the same circles and know each other. And that is because there's such a small group, right? But the perception is today as if it was a mass movement. It reminds me of Robin D.G. Kelly, who talks about the civil rights movement in the same way. He says that it's not a mass movement. Like, he's like, and so I think of abolition in the same way. It's really not a mass movement. When push comes to shove, the North will, abolish and gradually emancipate slaves. But, this isn't the kind of predominant sentiment. I think that that's the kind of short way to answer that question.
Right, thank you. And so where did the idea of gradual emancipation come from once the northern states started to incorporate it into their laws?
Yes, that's a great question. I think that gradual emancipation is really an amalgamation of, like, British common law coming from England, and also necessity, right? And so the states are trying to figure out how can we, get rid of this institution in a manner that we don't have to directly pay property owners for their property. And so I really think of this as an amalgamation of things and as necessity. The states are trying to figure out and trying to maneuver how can we do this, and through law they're able to kind of enact gradual emancipation, and then kind of follow up things so that people are not exported out of states and sold in other parts of the country, and they try to kind of shore it up so that it would eventually die out. And so it also becomes regionalized. It's kind of like the way Black codes were regionalized in the American South after the Civil War. So states started to do it, and other states started to look at how they were doing it. And so they would kind of mirror each other. And so, as a region, the North would do this from 1777 to 1804. But again, it takes a while. Like, say for example, in New York, 1799 they start to enact gradual emancipation. It takes until like 1827 for them to actually do it. Connecticut, the same thing. It takes a while for these things to actually manifest. But it really is kind of a combination of necessity and some common law things that they knew that they could rid themselves of slavery that way.
Okay, thank you. I know you must have mentioned this during your presentation, but could you remind me what the first state to enact gradual emancipation was?
The first date, 1774. 1784. I'm sorry.
Okay. And but how does Connecticut then compare to other northern states once they enacted gradual emancipation?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that in some ways they are a lot like other states. But Connecticut kind of drags it along longer than some other northern states, even longer than New York. But other states, like the state of New York, they enacted in 1799. It takes until 1827 for it to really manifest. But New York says that men have to serve their mothers' owners until the age of 28, and that women have to serve their mother's owners until the age of 25, right? And so they specify between, sexes, how long you would have to serve. You would see that, for both women and men, that Connecticut would have the same age of 25, and then they would lower that number to 21. And so much of it is the same. And then you have places like Vermont, right? Which in 1777, they enact gradual emancipation, and they kind of do it more expeditiously than other places. By the time they enter the Union in 1791, they have, essentially gotten rid of slavery. Historian Harvey Armani Winfield writes a lot about Vermont, and kind of people that slipped through the cracks in Vermont. We think that it was all, said and done by the early 1790s, but, he, finds people that kind of have slipped through the cracks in Vermont. And so, again, Vermont's a little quicker, Connecticut's a little longer, New York's in between the two. And so it really just depends on the state, but Connecticut did kind of drag theirs out quite long.
Yeah, slowly but steady. So to your knowledge, we know that the law requires slaveholders to free their slaves once they turn 25, but to your knowledge, are there any cases of slaveholders trying to find a crack in the system, somehow maybe altering their slave records or something like that, and refusing to flee their slaves?
Yeah, that happens, I think, more often than recorded. I'm thinking about a case with this guy, Dr. Mather, in Lyme, Connecticut, that holds on to his slave, Jenny, until she's much older than the age of 25. And so there's several cases that come up. James Marr as well, where his owners tried to hold him in captivity longer, and two, trying to take him outside of the state. And so there are a lot of cases that are documented, but I believe that there's much more that are undocumented, where slaveholders are trying to hold on to their property. The other thing is that even if you brought somebody in, I think like in the case of Nancy Johnson, if you brought somebody in, I think she was brought in from Georgia. You brought somebody into the state, you can get special permission from the legislator in order to keep your property. And so these laws were really geared towards the slaveholder and not the actual enslaved property. And so there was many ways around it. You could just simply not register the child that was born to your enslaved person. I'm sure you could get around that, just not even registering them. And then there was special permission if you brought people in from another state. And so there are ways around it. But I would even make the argument that there's many people that were not documented, and that were probably held in some state of slavery well beyond, the age of 25 or 21.
Thank you. And in that note, how then did the government at least try to keep track of all the enslaved peoples that were born and their ages and when they were supposed to be set free by their slaveholders?
Yeah, and so that's the other thing that's interesting, because the Gradual Emancipation Act is set into law in 1784. And it's really not until 4 years later in 1788 that they said that you had to register them, with the town clerk in the town that you lived in, both the name, the age, and the sex of the individual. And I find that very peculiar because, you kind of have this 4-year gap where you can kind of move the property, move, the human enslaved property, or, make sure that you didn't register them. So they did enact something later, but I think that probably should have been a part, if you're really serious about the Gradual Emancipation Act that you enacted in 1784, you should have had something in that act to make sure that, slaveholders were registering their enslaved people right away, right? And so because there is no gulf in between, when they can, there's no delay in when they can actually get their freedom. I'm sure, these enslaved people are interested in getting their freedom as soon as possible, right? And so there is some time before you kind of officially had to register them. The other way they probably kept track of them is through, census data, but also through, tax records and things of that nature.
Yeah, the tax records will always speak truth, I think. And, many white lawmakers and citizens maintain that gradual emancipation was really the more moral and judicious course of action in order to end slavery. But what arguments did they use to support this position?
Right. And so you would see that they didn't want to kind of like this idea of like shocking society by emancipating all of these Black people at once. So they thought maybe a gradual kind of introduction into society for these individual Black people. So like assimilating them slowly in to society. And so that was one of their arguments that were made. But I think that more so, they're making the argument of that these people, think about this. If these people have to work for 25 years in order to get their freedom, and this is the way that the state is paying for these people, think about how long like a car loan is. A car loan's like 5 to 6 years, right? A house loan could be 15 to 30 years. So they're saying you get to own these people for 25 years. So imagine how valuable these people are if you get to own them for 25 years before you emancipate them, right? And so, and this is the way that the state is kind of maneuvering, or even 21 years. That's a long time that the state is actually paying for these people before they can be emancipated, right? And so this whole ideal of morals and stuff like that is the kind of easy way out. I mean, these people are valuable. They're trying to hold these people as long as possible. These people do valuable jobs in, whether it be in construction or farming or domestically. And so they're trying to hold these people in captivity for as long as they can. And so this whole moral, ideal, I think is just, it has so many problems. I don't think there's nothing moral about, holding people in servitude, right? But the other ideal is like, just think about that, generally, like when you work at a job, the company or the job has your labor between certain hours, right? But think about owning and possessing a human being. I mean, so there's nothing moral there. And the moral arguments, I think, fall short. I really think they do. But two, just to see how long they're held for 21 or 25 years, I think you can understand how valuable these people are and how the owners don't want to get rid of them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you really look at the law and the way it is constructed, one would think that obviously the lawmakers were a lot more concerned with protecting the property rights of white slave owners rather than emancipating everybody. So
Yes.
do you think that would be a very fair assessment, right?
Yes. Like I always say, you can't take property in the United States without paying for it, right? And so you have to find a way to pay for these people. You take an individual like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass in today's money would be worth, maybe $30,000 to $35,000, right? You can't take that amount of property without paying for it, right? And so really, gradual emancipation is a way for the state not to pay directly for the people, right? You would have to go door to door and literally start issuing checks, right? And they understand that this would be a very expensive endeavor, right? So they don't want to get involved with that. So they're saying that you can own their labor for a time period, right? And then you would have to get rid of these individuals once they have reached the threshold for their emancipation. But yes, this is all geared towards the actual slaveholder and not the enslaved people.
Yeah, for sure. And for those enslaved people that were born right before the cutoff date of May the 1st, 1784, and all the people before that, what were their options then for gaining their freedom? Did they have any? What could they do?
Yeah, that's pretty awful, right? Like you missed the cutoff date, right? that is pretty bad. It's awful. And so what could they do to actually get their emancipation? You would see, thinking back to a person like Venture Smith that works a deal with his slaveholder in order for him to get his emancipation. But these things can be, there could be a lot of troubles in trying to pay for your emancipation directly from your owner. There's no real contract there. There's no guarantee that your slaveholder will actually emancipate you after that. And two, many times when slaveholders are emancipating people, you've seen this before, the Gradual Emancipation Act in 1784, is that these people were too old, or they had kind of, overworked them and things of that nature. And so there was other ways that you can get out of it. But oftentimes it was when you were kind of, older or disabled, are not able to take care of yourself, where they would say, hey, we're going to emancipate you. Basically, you had no more use to them, right? And so you were a disposable person, and we can kind of rid ourselves of you. And so, it's really sad because, to know that others are going to get emancipated and you would be enslaved for your entire life. It really kind of puts those people in an awful position. But the ideal was too that there was like future hope that future generations would be better off, and that your kids and your kids' kids would eventually be free. But that means nothing in the immediate time for people that are enslaved before the actual date in 1784.
Right. And as much as gradual emancipation is seen as this lauded step towards freedom, the truth is that, as you said, that these people that were emancipated, they would be separated from their families and potentially everybody that they knew once they turned 25. What other harsh realities do you think people often overlook when they're thinking about gradual emancipation as the start of emancipation in Connecticut?
Yeah, I think historian Stephen Hine makes a great argument when he calls free Blacks in the American North slaves at large. So he's saying that, too, there's so few of them. And so he just calls them slaves at large, where basically, if the whole group isn't free, it really kind of tampers your freedom, right? And so I really like the way he kind of, says that these free people in the American North before the Civil War are just slaves at large. Their lives really mirror those that are enslaved. They do, kind of slave-like labor. And so they're very on par with each other. And so, though they're free and they might have, more abilities to do things, as free people, they're still very much tied to the people that are enslaved. And two, like, say, for example, if, you're the one who gets emancipated and the rest of your family is enslaved. I mean, like, what type of life do you have, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what does that really mean for you, right? How does your life kind of play out, right? And so it's a really tough situation to be in. And I think of these people as kind of slaves at large, slaves without masters. Ira Berlin says of those free Blacks in the American South, right? And so this is a really kind of peculiar position to still be in, having, you being freed and, the rest of your community and the rest of your family still enslaved.
Yeah, I keep thinking about maybe having an older sibling that's just 1 year or a couple of months older than you, and that's like miss it, but just that much. But they're pretty much the same age as you, but they'll be enslaved for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
But along with gradual emancipation, there were several other series of laws passed around the same time to stop the slave trade in Connecticut. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, there's several, acts that are kind of added to stop the trade. James Mard talks about, being, bought and sold in Connecticut. So there is a kind of internal trade that is going on of people being exchanged because again, the Gradual Emancipation Act just says that you have to register and that people have to be emancipated at the age of 25 and then 21. In 1797, they add, the whole 21 thing, lowering the age, again, trying to gradually get the state off of slavery. But that doesn't say anything about the fact that you can be exchanged between owners in the state of Connecticut. But again, they tried to come down with more acts after the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1784 to, again, kind of, ease the state off of enslavement. And so you see that, really at the beginning in 1702 to, I believe, 1774, where they have the kind of importation acts. They're trying to act against that, but also, the kind of the sale internally as well. They're trying to really rid themselves of that as well.
Thank you. And also, the truth is that these laws not only affected the enslaved people of Connecticut, but they also very much affected the free Black people of Connecticut as well. For example, free Black Connecticans, when they were traveling from town to town, for example, they were required to carry a certificate or a document stating, "Oh, I am free. Please don't detain me because I am not a runaway slave." So what other ways did these laws affect the free Black people of Connecticut?
Well, I think that the movement of people is something that is, controlled by, it's something that they want to control, because if the less Black people can move, they don't want people to run off, right? And so the passes, the registering, they're trying to make sure that they're monitoring blacks in their kind of activities and what they're doing, so that they're not running off and stuff like that. And so there's many things that they're enacting, that they're coming up with to kind of control the movement of Black people. The passes are, a big one, but the passes are something that's happening throughout the North, right? That you have to have these passes to prove that you're free, right? And again, this is telling you that that free Black people and enslaved Black people, there's a small gulf in between, being a free Black person and an enslaved Black person. In many ways, their realities are in many ways the same. And so, moving about the state of Connecticut could be very difficult for a free person. You could be, going to church or attending to your business or etc. But these passes were there, and they were there to monitor movement.
Right. And I know that it was required for enslaved people, if they wanted to buy or sell something, that they needed a written permission from their owner in order to be able to do that. Do you know if free Black people also needed something like that in order to sell and buy?
No, the free Blacks wouldn't need that. That was kind of something that was kind of given to them by their property owners to make sure that they, could exchange merchandise. But free Blacks, I don't think free Blacks were affected by that. But there has to be a heightened level of suspicion, right? That a free Black is selling something, right? And so that's kind of always there, packed in.
Yeah, right. And how were these laws, these gradual emancipation laws, received by the free Black community, and how did they react?
The free Black community, I'm thinking about the Talcum Street Church in Hartford. I'm thinking about the churches throughout the state, really, New London, etc. I mean, they reacted cautiously to these gradual emancipation acts. Obviously, they were upset about the kind of the speed at which things were moving. But it's kind of different in that in Connecticut, I've met, several Black people in Connecticut that their descendants in their family go like way back from them, being free, right? Which is just kind of different from the general experience of African Americans in different parts of the country. But they were really, angry at the speed in which the law kind of would manifest. And you would see this at the Negro election days that Blacks would have, where they would, would elect Black governors. And so the Black governors really kind of expressed their disappointment with the speed in which these laws kind of manifested through the state, but also for individual cases like Nancy Johnson. I'm thinking about where people, came to battle on her behalf and really kind of made a fuss about, the ways in which she was being treated. Also, things like, the Amistad case and stuff like that. So they were very active with things that had to do with the emancipation of Black people throughout the state. And so they were very concerned about that because they understood that this was going to affect their lives as well, right? And so, but I'm thinking about those Negro election days and those Black governors. They were not happy about this Gradual Emancipation Act at all, and they wanted it to move at an accelerated pace. And I think that that's part of the reason why in 1797 they pushed back the age to 21 because I think that there was kind of building pressure to get this thing, moving forward. But even then, you could see that it would still take a while for it to really manifest in the state.
Thank you. And finally, my last question is, how can we help people understand that gradual emancipation was a process rather than an event, a singular event that happened?
Yeah, I think that, historians kind of, deal with these words of emancipation and abolition. But I would say that emancipation comes to individuals, abolition comes to an actual group, right? And so that's the best way to kind of understand it. That, emancipation is good. It's good for individuals, it's good for families, but abolition is what is really desired from the Black community in the state of Connecticut, right? They understood that, emancipations here and there, and emancipations at 25 and 21, that's, fine. But abolition was really the goal, is to rid the state of Connecticut and to rid the nation of slavery in and of itself, because they, it was something that was directly affecting their community. It was something that, really was against the documents, the founding documents of the country. And so they wanted to make sure that there was abolition. Emancipation comes to individuals, abolition, really comes to a group of people, and they wanted a collective abolition of slavery in the state of Connecticut.
Right. Thank you so much, Dan. That was really, really amazing. We have a lot of really, really good comments in the comment section. We also got a couple of questions, so if it's okay with you, let's take a look at those. So Donald first he says, "Hi, Dan. Did the U.S. Constitution provision for the U.S. Constitution provision for ending of the international slave trade, which New England merchants had been deeply involved in, contribute to support for the gradual emancipation in Connecticut?"
Yes, that's a very good question. So the British abolished the slave trade in 1807. The United States does it in 1808. And so there was this ideal at the end of the 1700s, the beginning of the 1800s, that, the British were starting to kind of erode slavery in the slave trade. So, slaves in the British Empire were no longer coming directly from Africa, but that didn't end slavery in the empire, right? Slavery in the empire of the British ended in, it was enacted in 1833, and then it went into effect August 1st of 1834. And so you see that Connecticut's right around that age, and this is kind of the beginning kind of age of emancipation, if you will. And so that did have some influence on what the state of Connecticut was doing, because there was so many people that were involved in like the shipping industry. There were so many connections in Connecticut to the Caribbean, right? So I do think that had a big effect. What the British were doing did kind of send a tidal wave throughout the world of saying like this is no longer acceptable. The other thing that the British do, which is really interesting as well, is they have an African squadron that is patrolling the coast of West Africa, right? They have they have the most powerful navy in the world. And so they're actually patrolling for slave ships, right? And so, I mean, it is major what the British are doing in terms of, in terms of what they're doing in the world of kind of abolition. And there's many, abolitionists in the United States that would kind of look up to England. Now that's not to totally alleviate England from any wrongdoing, because we know that the English are the primary buyers of cotton that's coming from the American South, right? And so they get out of the slave trade themselves and abolish slavery throughout their empire, but they're still buying slave-made cotton, right? And so you can't totally alleviate the British of wrongdoing, but they do start to send, a signal to the rest of the world that the slave trade has to end, and they would abolish slavery throughout their empire in 1834, where they abolished I think it's 800,000 people, 600,000 in Jamaica alone, that they abolished slavery for. Even in that abolishment of slavery, they have some apprenticeships for 4 years in Jamaica, right? So this is kind of a gradual process as well. And so they're worried about, kind of paying for people's property again, in some areas of the British Empire.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very easy to forget how extremely layered the economy of slavery really was, with the British abolishing slavery but still buying the cotton.
I always try to make sure people don't forget that, right? It's like they're still involved.
Yeah, right.
But the other thing I should say that it's hard to buy, free made cotton, right? And abolitionists would actually try that. They would say, we don't want any cotton that slaves were involved in making. And basically it's like, well, you're not going to have any clothes, because and two, we would be surprised today of where our clothes are made from. Like, we would be absolutely, if you look into it, you don't have to look very hard. Mm-hmm. Our clothes are not, made from kind of, in great labor situations, right? But yeah, so some of the abolitionists tried to buy, cotton that was not made by slaves. But I mean, where do you get those shirts from? Where do you get those socks from? Right?
Yeah, and I'm sure they must have been buying all the sugar in the world for their tea.
Yeah.
So Donna also has a question. Do you think the abolition movement influenced the moral climate? Let me bring this up. Mm-hmm. Do you think the abolition movement influenced the moral climate and eventually forced slave owners to give it up?
Yeah, I do think, the enactment or starting to abolish slavery can help to move morals in a certain direction. But if they were truly like moral and kind of had that in their heart, they wouldn't have to be forced by the enactments, right? And so, it's really kind of hard to investigate the hearts of, historical figures and people in history. But I think through the kind of laws and through the behaviors, you really see that abolition is not something that's kind of thought of widely. Think about this. The American Anti-Slavery Society was established in 1833. I think the Anti-Slavery Society in Connecticut was established in 1838. Slavery has been going on since 1619 in the United States and codified through law since 70s, the 1670s, right? And so, if people are about abolition, I mean, there's, and so this whole notion of that, the abolitionist movement and stuff like that, it's sometimes it's really kind of a misnomer. But the other thing is, I think that push come to shove, Northerners did not like kind of slavery once, like say in the state of Connecticut in 1848, once they had gotten rid of slavery in Connecticut, I think that they didn't like it in their backyard, and they would kind of fight back on the ideals of kind of states' rights, that they didn't want slaveholders kind of bringing their property through the state of Connecticut. And so I think when push came to shove, as you get nearer and nearer to the Civil War, they do really start to kind of push back against it, and you get a momentum against slavery that's kind of building as you get towards the 1860s.
Right. And Charles has another question. Do you think that slaves may have been forced to bear more children by their owners to compensate for ending of the transatlantic slave trade and the implementation of these gradual abolition laws? That's a very good question.
Forced to bear more children. See, I think that is always an issue that we don't really address in slavery. Something like 80% of enslaved African women, were sexually abused, or there was kind of some sexual misconduct that was going on. And so, and two, people, they were property. And so I think that there could have been, I'll say this, at the end of the slave trade, at the beginning of the slave trade, women were not very valuable. At the end of the slave trade, when you get the British starting to abolish it, abolishing it in 1807 in the United States in 1808, the price of Black women goes up because they understand that they want to be able to kind of sustain the community. And in order to sustain the community, you have to have women to produce enslaved people. And so, yes, you do see that the value of women from the beginning of the slave trade, where their value was down, to the end of the slave trade, where their value went up. And so I do think that there is a conscious decision being made by slave traders and enslavers to make sure that they have enough women to kind of regenerate the population. So that's there.
Wow, that's incredible. Charles has another question. Are there records of free persons in Connecticut purchasing their relatives and spouses under the guise of owning them? The guise of owning them. Sorry.
Yes, I think that happens with a very famous individual, Venture Smith, who's well known about in Connecticut. But yes, people are trying to buy their relatives, because those are your closest connections. And so there are records of people, purchasing the freedom of family members in Connecticut. And so that is happening. And again, that is because in order to be kind of fully free, your family members and your loved ones also have to have that status as well.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question, and I apologize for all the other questions that are here, but we're getting a little short on time. But Pauline asks, some towns' emancipation records are in the deed books. If they are not there, where else can one look for the records?
Yeah, so that's kind of a tough question in the state of Connecticut, because there's so many different municipalities. and towns and stuff like that. And so that's really kind of a localized question, and a question that you'll have to ask your local historic society where you can get a hold of those records. Often, Black history is to research Black history is very, very difficult from the standpoint that you're often looking through the records of the enslaver, right? And so, even to the point where, there's a whole slew of slave narratives that are written. And even those people, historians like John Stouffer would call kind of privileged slaves, right? Because the average enslaved person, doesn't have the ability to read or write, and and to kind of put themselves into the historical record. And so it's very difficult to kind of get the side of the enslaved. But in terms of the records of those that are emancipated, you really have to kind of solicit your local historic society, who can hopefully point you in the direction of where those records would be, because they can be in a number of places. Sometimes they're in, probate records, sometimes they're in wills and stuff like that. You can kind of find these things and then go from those documents to find other documents about people in their, emancipation.
Right. Thank you so much, then. This is really amazing, really eye-opening, and just thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. Is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap things up?
No, there's not.
Okay, awesome. Well, again, Dan, thank you so much for joining us, and everyone, thank you for your questions. And I apologize again that we didn't have time to get to all of these questions, but please do feel free to, there's a post-program survey at the end of the video description, so we would love to hear your feedback if you have the chance. Also, I'd like to tell you a little bit about some upcoming programs that we have here at the Connecticut Old State House. Next week on February, not next week, coming up in February, 17, we have What to Call a Call to Arms, the Language of Democracy. That they were going to be joined by Rob Keif, the word guy, who's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the words that we should know when it comes to democracy. On February 18th, we have our next Encounters program. This is a program brought to you by the Hartford History Center at Hartford Public Library. That will be at 6 p.m. on February 18th. And also on Tuesday, February 23rd, 12 p.m., we have our next conversation at noon, Ghosts of History, the Amistad's Lingering Impact. We'll be joined by Marcus Rediker, the author of the Amistad. He'll be talking to us a little bit about that and his documentary. And also, if you're in the mood for some more programs for Black History Month, we do have some recommendations from the Witness Stones Project. On February 10th at 12, we have Understanding Slavery in the North, brought to you by the Gilder Lemon Center at Yale. And on February 14th at 4 p.m., Finding Slavery in Madison and Guilford, brought to you by the Madison Historical Society. And on Tuesday, February 18th at 5:30, Honoring the Silent, Documenting African American and Native American History in Connecticut by the Norwalk Historical Society. So if you're interested in any of those, please do check out the Witness Stones Project website. And finally, our Connecticut History Day contest is coming up, and we would love you, if you have the chance, to join our judges. If you're interested in history and would like to help out some students doing their projects, judging their projects, do visit historydayct.org to register to become a judge. So thank you so much again, Dan. Thank you everybody for watching today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.